did in the 80s.
Yeah, you're up.
I guess the next one that I have, and I wanted to step back from the technology thing, and I wanted to step back into something a little bit more lighthearted that happened in the 80s, which I thought was culturally relevant, especially in my situation right now. WrestleMania 3.
I would, you know what? I would expand that. I agree with that. I would expand it to wrestling in general and the way that the presentation of pro wrestling altered in general, because that happened in the 80s.
And this is why I'm going with WrestleMania 3. Okay,
It's certainly the point of
It is the point of launch as far as professional wrestling and everybody recognizing that pro wrestling was a phenomena in the United States. Now, I understand that the territory system. I understand that in the territory system, there were guys who were drawing, 15, 20, 30,000 draws in different arenas. But this is the first time in a major arena where we'll go with 80+ thousand people congregated in mass to watch what was significantly probably like the main event of the 80s. Not disputing that Savage and Steamboat had a phenomenal match. Not taken away at all. But that's not what people paid money to see. I was going to say,
but that wasn't the draw of the show.
Yeah, that wasn't the draw of the show. The draw of the show was to see if Hulk Hogan could beat the Foreign Menace.
Andre
the Giant. And for the condition that Andre was in, they did one hell of a job making him look like he was making him look like he was the monster that he was.
Unbeatable.
Yeah,
really.
Unbeatable.
And I think I would just say, as I list this in the overall rankings, I would say WrestleMania 3 / the nationalization of wrestling, because ultimately what you're talking about is the pinnacle, so to speak, of that effort.
Yes.
In WrestleMania 3, where all of a sudden it was on a national consciousness, if not an international consciousness at that point.
Well, where I was going with this is that was a spark.
Yes, absolutely.
If we say it's a spark, what lit the firecracker for 1980s pro wrestling into what we have today? Because if you look at WrestleMania 1, happened in Madison Square Garden. WrestleMania 2 happened over 3 cities. They were trying something. Didn't work out
very well. Yeah.
WrestleMania 3, that's when you get the phenomena of WrestleMania.
Yeah.
Up to this point where now they're doing 2 nights in Philadelphia. Sold out, like they sold 60,000 tickets each night. That is...
oddly enough, wrestling isn't on my list.
Really?
Yeah, I had thought about it, and I put something else instead. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, that's my call, WrestleMania 3, and I can understand why you put pro wrestling in the 80s, because it also, the other weird thing that it also consolidated wrestling.
Yes, well, that's why I was saying there has to be you have to include the nationalization of wrestling in with WrestleMania 3, because ultimately you don't get to that point if it's not for the fact that Vince McMahon begins to buy up all the territories and create a national.
It wasn't so much that he bought up all the territories. I don't know why I was like, I'm an Italian.
Yeah. Taking my gimmick.
Yeah. I don't know why I was doing that. Sorry, but I don't feel it was him necessarily buying up the territories. It was him buying up the main talent from those territories and putting them in one place.
Yeah, and there's also an argument for including the reality that utilizing cable television.
Oh, very much so.
And for that expansion and everything else that, cable TV I think started at somewhere in the 60s, but it really came of age, so to speak, in the late 70s into the 80s when it really started to expand into other homes.
It's funny you should mention that. You mind if I knock another one off my list?
You might as well.
After WrestleMania 3, cable television is on my list.
Cable TV is a tough one because it begins long before the 80s, but it doesn't enter the real expansion of it.
And that's what the expansion of cable television, because
its move into the suburbs, if you will, doesn't really happen until the late 70s through the 80s.
Because I was considering TBS, the USA Network, and then the variety of other cable networks, HBO, MTV, like it really, really expanded, and it made. I think
I think putting it as the expansion of cable TV is probably the way to put it.
It made it affordable.
Yes.
It was more
Yes.
affordable in the 80s,
Yes.
and I think because it became commonplace and is slowly dying out at this point because of the internet, but we wouldn't have got there if not for the expansion of cable television.
Sure, absolutely. And from that, I think it's a
You
natural...
go ahead and you knock 2 off your list.
Okay,
because,
all right.
That's only fair.
All right, well then I'm going to go, since we're already in that thing, I'm going to say the launch of MTV.
That's also on my list.
I think the launch of MTV is a moment in media history that changes everything. It certainly changes the music industry.
Oh, very much so.
To a large degree, we were, for the first time, exposed to acts from foreign countries in a very big way. I mean, there had been the British invasion, but we had the new wave that came from that. But then there were artists from all over the world that ended up being featured as a result of MTV. And more specifically, the slow adoption of music videos here in the U.S. versus what was happening overseas. So, a lot of that, it's changed everything. So its impact on pop culture can't be understated.
Well, yeah, and I was having this conversation with my buddy who I went to the show with, and we were talking about how we were able to get the Less Than Jake album, and how he never had an official copy of the album that we went to go see because he couldn't find it in the record store. And I was telling him how I couldn't find any other copies, and if I did find a copy, it was like $19.99. But the exposure that MTV gave to bands, to kids who didn't live around, the culture of, okay, this is an album you can only get at certain stores for diehard music fans.
Yeah.
And now you're being introduced to the Buggles.
Yeah, and I think there's and even certain artists that we take for granted right now saw their massive expansion as a result of MTV. Yeah. Certainly Madonna would be one of those. And another would be Michael Jackson, I think. I mean, although he was famous already, I mean, geez, his videos really what that did for his popularity.
But and most of the stations, probably there was a college radio station playing, whatever, no problem there. But most of the music that you heard was top 40, personally selected, this, that, and the other thing. And to get certain albums to trickle into the suburbs or middle America or where we live in rural, very difficult to do.
Prior to MTV, certainly.
Prior to MTV. So because of MTV, it exposed more music. And now, because of MTV, you have all the videos and all the obscure artists that you could ever want from the power of the internet and the cell phone. So
yes.
It stacks up on itself.
And the second one I'm going to list, I'm going to go out there a little bit. We haven't touched on anything like this, really. The launch of the first 24-hour news network, CNN, in 1981.
I did not have that on my list.
I think that is, given where we're at today.
Go ahead. Drop that in there.
Yeah.
I feel that is significant.
Yeah.
That is very significant.
Given where we're at today, think of how things have changed with the fact that we have exposure to 24-hour news.
It's scary.
And what it did, because if you look at 24-hour news, the problem with a 24-hour news network that runs nothing else,
paranoia,
well, is that it has to draw money.
Oh, yeah.
It has to draw money. There has to be advertising dollars coming in, etc. In order to make those advertising dollars, you and I both know because we've worked in that field, is that you have to be able to show the potential advertiser a demographic.
Yes.
In order to do that, the news always said before that, the news is for everyone. It's journalism. Couldn't do that with a 24-hour news network. And so as a result, you now have networks that cater.
Yeah.
And the easiest way to do it was along political lines. And so now we know that these 24-hour networks are not news networks per se.
No.
They are more propaganda networks as a result of needing to be able to produce a demographic for the advertising dollar. So it changed. It changed journalism completely.
Well, it changed journalism completely. It gave people a narrative that they could follow. It fed into confirmation bias. This is a conversation that I did have with a classmate when I was at college, and they asked me what news that I watch, and I said, well, I don't like, and I don't care for the MSNBCs, I don't care for the CNNs, and I don't care for the Fox Newses because I don't like conjecture in my news.
Yeah.
And that's what you're getting at throughout all the news sites is like, okay, this happened. Now let me tell you why this is all screwed up.
Yeah.
Or this happened, and let me tell you why this is all screwed up. I don't want your conjecture to feed into a confirmation bias that I might have or you might have or anybody. Just give me the facts and I will make up my own opinion.
I think our mutual friend Royce explains it best. I love this explanation. He said that with these networks you get 2 to 5 minutes of news at the top of the hour, and then 55 to 57 minutes of opinion about that news.
Yeah.
And so it's a very interesting thing, and you can't deny that the 1980s, for better or worse, gave us that.
And then what happens is people can start manipulating the facts based off of like the 2 inches of, the 2 minutes of news. It's like there was an accident somewhere, and then they figure out like one news channel will blame somebody, and then the other news channel will blame somebody else.
Yeah.
And then you have to pick a side, or people pick a side based off of a confirmation bias. So yes,
Yeah.
CNN.
Yeah.
Totally agree with that.
You're up.
Nintendo.
Okay, I have that, but I did it as the explosion of the home video game console.
Okay. I can understand where you came.
The reason I say that is because the reason I word it that way is because Nintendo does not happen if the cartridge system isn't developed.
Right.
That doesn't happen without Atari.
Right.
So again, I was trying, because Nintendo was the first one that came to mind, but then I thought, well, no, you don't get that if you don't have this. So I was trying to get to where... this is how I was thinking when I was coming up with my list.
Which is completely natural.
I was trying to figure out where the beginning of it is.
Okay.
And so I just made it a blanket statement of the home console video game explosion.
Okay. Well, the reason why I chose Nintendo was the same philosophy that I used with WrestleMania 3. Like, it existed, we knew it existed, but something needed to lay the groundwork and something needed to spark. The reason why I didn't put Atari is because the video game industry went into the toilet because everybody was making 3-penny games, and if you're not used to the reference of 3-penny games, it's a 1920s reference because we're older and we believe in the brouhaha. But what Nintendo did was take an 8-bit system and expand the possibility of what you could do in a video game. Like, it wasn't just put the quarter in, you play until you die, and then you put another quarter in, you play until you die, or it's not a one-screen shot. They opened up vast worlds and showed the possibilities of what you could do with a video game.
Well, yes, but and this is the only. It's not necessarily a disagreement. I wouldn't call it that, but we also have to consider where we were with the technology boom at the time. Atari didn't have the ability at that point to expand the memory on their system in order to allow for that sort of thing.
That's why I'm going with Nintendo.
Yeah, so I see where you're coming from. That's sort of the. I think Nintendo is, and maybe this is because of our age difference.
Yeah.
I look at Nintendo as the bridge that takes you from the birth and the massive explosion that Atari started, and then instead of it dying, Nintendo takes it and gets us the rest of the way to where we are today, because you then have... So I think there's an argument for both the way I'm wording it and you're wording it, because you can't discount the fact that Atari starts it, but at the same time, like you're saying, if Nintendo doesn't expand upon it, you never have PlayStation, you never have Xbox, you never have any of those things, because it takes that bridge, if you will, in order to get us over the hump of the video game crash, in order to do that. So I think it's, I don't know whether to list it as two separate things or to put it together in one big thing, but...
The other reason why I chose Nintendo is at one point in between the 80s and 90s, it didn't matter what gaming system you had, your mom called it a Nintendo.
Yeah. Well, or unless you were my age, in which case she called it an Atari. Again,
It all depends.
it's a few years, but it's such a massive difference.
And that's what makes the show like palatable, or not palatable, but really, really cool, is because we have two different viewpoints.
Yeah.
Because you being a little older than I opens up the world for some people. What?
Mention my age.
Oh no, I said a little
no.
older. I mean, it's not my fault you got here on a horse and buggy. But anyway.
I'm hurt.
Oh no, you're not. You'll get over it. But you know what I'm.
Yes.
You know what I mean. But because we have that age difference, it gives us the ability to look at things differently and give different perspective. And then we have people who understand your perspective and my perspective, and understand where they marry.
This is a huge debate, folks. If you've got an opinion on this, put it down. Put it down there. Let's talk about it. Let's get this figured out. And it's how are we going to be listing this one in the grand scheme of things?
And it's not so much a debate as a conversation, because we understand where the other person is coming from.
Yeah, without a doubt.
And it's not a matter of who's right or wrong. It's just understanding the person's perspective on why they feel the way that they do.
It's how do we word it that it's inclusive at this point?
Yes.
That's the question, I think, at this point. We'll get away from technology for a moment.
Yeah.
I think this is a big one. This is absolutely huge in my opinion, especially as you relates to pop culture. It's the repeal of restrictions regarding advertising to children that was done by Ronald Reagan.
That was not on my list.
This decision, for those of you who are sitting there going, what is he talking about? There had been a law in place that said you could not advertise to children whatsoever. Ronald Reagan repealed this. I mean, it was literally months after he took office. The decision to repeal that allows cartoons to begin featuring products that are designed for children, specifically Masters of the Universe, Transformers, G.I. Joe, Thundercats, all this sort of thing.
All the cool things we grew up with.
Yes, allows for these franchises to be born and take
Jim
right
LaPlante,
there.
thank you.
Yeah, right there. And not only do they take place, but they are still here to this day.
Yes.
So it is this decision that ultimately changes media forever with respect to what is out there and what is now a permanent part of our culture. Mm-hmm. We're celebrating 40 years of Transformers this year.
Yeah.
And talk about a big one. I mean, certainly we've discussed on this show previously the death of Optimus Prime and how that affected things and so on and so forth. So none of that happens without the repeal of this restriction, and I think it's a really important moment in the 80s.
And I agree with you, because not for nothing, if we didn't have those cartoons and we were just given the toy but have no idea of what the play pattern was or what the origin story was or who these characters were, would you really go in and like, oh, that robot, he turns into a fire truck, or that robot, he's an airplane, or that robot, he's a pistol, or that robot, he turns into, I don't know, a robot.
Well, I think the where you're going with that, and there's actual physical proof of this, is that the original run of toys had already been released in Japan.
Oh yeah, no, that's where I'm going.
But
with
the toys themselves, they were from different lines, and they didn't
they
really
didn't
have
they
characters.
didn't have an origin story. There was no Bible written on them.
No, and so they didn't sell very well.
No.
And when we saw them, when Takara sent them over here, and Hasbro looked at them and said, "I think I know what we can do here," they involved some folks from the comic industry who ultimately were responsible for creating the characters and the backstory and everything else, and ultimately it exploded. And so what we learned from that was that giving them characters and personalities and everything else, it mattered so much. And that the same could be said for G.I. Joe, because you had the same group of people involved.
I was thinking that too, because that was going to be my next point. This guy wears a blue suit. This guy wears a green suit. This guy's got a rocket launcher. This guy's got a machine gun. That's great, but what do they do?
Yeah.
Why should I relate to
Why do we care?
Yeah, why do we care?
And I think that another discussion we could have one day is certainly the people that impacted the 80s, because you start, oh gosh, is it Bob Budiansky, I think is how you say the name of the gentleman that came up with the original Transformers and the story over a weekend. I think he did it, and so on and so forth. So there's a guy whose impact on the 1980s you can't understate. But